Hi, listeners. We want to tell you about a podcast we're really digging. It's called Christopher Kimball's Milk Street Radio. Every week, they travel the world to find the most fascinating stories about food, including children who harvest cod tongues after school in Norway and a detective who tracks down food thieves. And on Milk Street Radio, you can always find the unexpected. The comedian who ranks apples using an elaborate 100-point system, the secret history of grocery stores, and how to eat your way through Italy. They also interview the most beloved names in food like Jacques Pepin, Sola El-Waylly, Jose Andres, Jet Tila, Ina Garten, Nigella Lawson, and Padma Lakshmi. Plus, co-hosts Christopher Kimball and Sarah Moulton do live calls with listeners and answer their questions about ingredients, techniques, and culinary mysteries. Like, why roasting a leg of lamb made one caller's oven explode? Ever wonder why your bread won't rise or your souffle falls flat? Chris and Sarah have the answers. You'll also hear from a rotating cast of contributors, including Kenji Lopez-Alt, Cheryl Day, Dan Pashman from The Sporkful, and Alex Ainuz, a French guy cooking from YouTube. Take a listen at 177milkstreet.com/radio or just search your podcast app for Milk Street Radio. You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
HRN is food radio supported by you. Learn more at heritageradionetwork.org.
Hearst Ranch is a proud sponsor of the Heritage Radio Network. Learn more about Hearst Ranch at HearstRanch.com.
Culture and Flavor is a podcast about food and culture centered in Black and Indigenous foodways. Hosted by myself, Zella Palmer, right here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Each episode features high vibrational conversations with cultural bearers, chefs, farmers, scholars, barbecue pit masters, and more. Where there is flavor, there is history. Join me on Culture and Flavor and all of my guests as we share stories that will have you praise dancing, cooking, conjuring, and inspiring your culinary journey. Welcome to another episode of Culture and Flavor with your host, Zella Palmer. Y'all, I am so excited today. I know I say that at every episode because I love my guests, but I am super excited today because I have an interview with family today. And I'm just excited to get into these conversations about us growing up in multi-generational, super diverse households that are extended family and the power of extended family. I'm excited to welcome Mariama Diallo. Mariama Diallo is basically like a god sister to me because we've known each other since our parents put us. Our parents were dear, 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 dear friends. And we'll get into the story of, just how amazing it was to grow up in these households from New York to Chicago. But Mariama Diallo is a Brooklyn-based writer-director. Her debut feature, Master from Amazon Studios with Regina Hall, was released in March 2022 after premiering in U.S. dramatic competition at the Sundance Film Festival. Previous work includes the short films Hair Wolf and White Devil, as well as HBO's Random Acts of Flyness. She has been featured in Variety's 10 Directors to Watch and Filmmakers Magazine's 25 New Faces of Independent Film. And some of you all might also have seen her recent debut with Other Black Girl. I know I watched it. And so I'm just so excited to have her on here. I want to start with our journey. I think I'm going to start with just how we know each other and just our families. So growing up, just quickly, and I want her to tell the story, but her parents are still alive, but mine passed. But they were just, I can't even describe the power or magnitude of just who they are. And maybe Mariama could fill that in for me. But, my dad was working with the United Nations at the time when Kofi Annan was the Undersecretary General, and her dad still works for the United Nations, and they became good friends. And every Thanksgiving at our extended uncle's house, Uncle Wambu, who is from Kenya, who is also a professor, we have, since we were babies, we had Thanksgiving at his house every Thanksgiving, and it is an annual tradition, and it is the most fascinating conversations. I mean, these are professors, activists, former revolutionaries. I mean, if you don't walk away from those things, if you don't walk away learning about who you are in this world, I don't know, what you're learning, but it is the best classroom that we have ever had in life. And so
Absolutely.
Every Thanksgiving, we would be in New York. My parents would drive us up to New York, and we would either stay at Mariama's mom's house and dad's house, and we would all pack in her room. And then it's been that way, an annual, an event every Thanksgiving in Manhattan at Uncle Wambu's house. But I want to get started just, talking about that moment, just growing up in that household, and then will lead to the journey of you becoming this amazing filmmaker who my mom, your Aunt Alice, was always rooting for, and her face would just light up every time. And when she saw you on TV or whatever, she'd say, Mariama.
Oh, yes. First of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast, Zella. It's like you said, we go back, for me, beyond memory. You, Uncle Buzz, Auntie Alice have just been part of my life since I can remember. And, I think our parents really passed the baton on to us, which is pretty amazing because, like you said, they were just such that group was such an engaged, such a, politically conscious group, and not just in terms of politics, but also in terms of culture, literature, music. I have so many memories from Uncle Wambu's Thanksgiving of, hearing poets read, snippets of their new work, or, hearing a section of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's new novel at the time. And it was all just normal, and it all just, I guess everybody has a kind of Thanksgiving like this. And it was only until years later that I realized what a unique experience it was. And it's just it's so special. And your parents formed such a backbone of that experience for me. Uncle Buzz's laugh, I will forever hear ringing in my ears. I definitely, like a few times would have, like, he would be in New York with Auntie Alice, and like around the time of Thanksgiving, maybe we're just in New York, and I would have a friend over, just like some random little white girl, and they'd hear this big booming laugh and be like, what is going on? And be like, doesn't everyone have an Uncle Buzz? Like, what do you So it's just like, I'm just so thankful, because I think, in this way where it just seeps into your being and seeps into the way that you see the world, like all of those adults that we grew up with really gave us such a unique perspective, and they encouraged our creativity. And it's like you said about Auntie Alice, like I remember more recently, only like a few years ago, my mom was telling me, she said, oh, well, Alice was watching The View and they mentioned your film, and she sat up and said, are they talking about my Mariama? And I love that so much. So yeah, it's just like, what a great start they gave us. And it set up everything.
I think, when I think about also just, who Uncle Wambu is, I mean, he's a professor, in African-American studies. He was born in Kenya, and he was the central point of where everyone met for Thanksgiving. Yeah. And what makes Uncle Wambu so important and integral to our families, his first wife, who is our also extended cousin, Mathoni and Wanja's dad, was married to my mother's best friend, Judy Wambu. Mm-hmm. And Judy Wambu was African-American. So through that marriage, he was able also to learn more about the African-American experience, particularly in the 60s and 70s during the height of many movements, right? And so I think that gave him very different perspective than most immigrants to African immigrants to this country. So his house was the central point for everyone's. I mean, we have folks from Senegal, Nigeria, African Americans from Harlem. I mean, the whole Black intellectual world was in this house every Thanksgiving. And we had, Kenyan food, we had West African food, we had,
Chinese food.
It was such a hodgepodge. And he has this beautiful rent-controlled space, right?
Yep.
In Manhattan that they've been there since the 80s. And it is just this beautiful, just piece of love. And he has pictures. I mean, it always felt good to go and see pictures and pull out albums and see yourself as a child in those albums, or to see you, framed young with Auntie Florence and Uncle Jabril, And so I am just so grateful, like you said, for that grounding, and I wanted to even just talk about your parents, because I think that also shapes who you are, and the relationship that we all had in this community of, intellectualism, art, culture, great food. I would love for you to talk about your mom, where she's from, your dad, where she's from, and then maybe some memories of, them just Uncle Buzz and Uncle Jabril sitting downstairs and us peeking down like, are they done talking yet?
Yes. Oh, the talking could go on. It could go on. It could go on. It's like so many memories also, just really quickly of, when you're a kid and then you're like, okay, are we going home? Your parents say, oh, yeah. We're just, just a couple minutes. We're just going to say goodbye. An hour passes. They're deep in conversation. And Uncle Buzz always had a lot to talk about. So that was going to be a long goodbye. But yeah, so just a little bit of background about my parents and myself. So my mom was born and raised in London, born to a Jamaican mother and a Sierra Leonean father who both came over to London in, I believe it's the mid 50s, late 50s, which was, as you can only imagine, like a really racist time. I mean, probably more so than today, or at least let's say more openly so. And so I think that amongst the beauty of their, of my mom's childhood, there was a lot of challenges. And I think that made a certain perspective within her that was very important for her life and for her kids' lives to be very positive, really focused on self-love, on pride, Black pride. I think that on the plus side, that kind of James Brown era of, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, really, hit home for my mom and her siblings. And that just became a foundational principle of how she would lead her life, is definitely to make sure that we were aware of our history and our roots and our people, and really, really proud. So I think that it makes it make all the more sense that ultimately she found her way into this group of, really like-minded, socially active people, eventually in New York. My dad was studying in London at the time. So he was born and raised in Guinea-Bissau, which is a tiny, tiny nation adjacent to Senegal. Well, he was born in Senegal, raised in Guinea-Bissau, and then also studied in Senegal. So kind of, these borders are ultimately completely superfluous when it comes down to actual, populations. But he won a scholarship. He was a really, he excelled as a student, and he won a scholarship that allowed him to continue studying in London. And that's where he met my mom. And, eventually they got married. They moved first to Geneva because my dad was starting to work with the United Nations. And then from Geneva to New York, which is where they made their life. And I'm thinking about, you may know even better than I do, Zella, how it was that Uncle Christopher and Uncle Buzz and my dad ended up meeting and making friends, because I don't even really know the origin story of their friendship.
I forget. I think it was through either Uncle Jan. I don't know if you remember Uncle Jan, but Uncle Jan Carew is the poet laureate of British Guyana and just an incredible, organizer and activist during that time. And he was also at Northwestern University. And it just is, it was such a small group of, I won't say, well, it was a very select group of all of them, that were who read voraciously, who read Franz Fanon and, and all these other, intellectual books at the time that were shaping a movement. And I'm sure, because of Daddy as well, my dad, just really involved in international politics. My dad was really working hard to, create projects with, Kofi Annan at the time, Sashi Thoreau. These are all people at the United Nations. And I'm sure he met him through his work with them. And then there's also the special rapporteur on race. I can't remember his name, Dudu Dieng. And you remember that name? Yeah. And,
yep.
And so they were always, every time, my parents would go to New York, there was always these meetings at the UN and these lunch meetings. And that was so powerful to me. I didn't appreciate it as much as I should have at the time. But now looking back and just seeing my parents in this, room where, and your dad in this room, and your dad, was always wearing traditional, and it was a beautiful sight to see. And it was an exciting time too, because Kofi Annan had been announced as the undersecretary, and then his, under him and his cabinet or whatever was Sashi Thoreau from Kerala, India. So it was a really exciting time, and they were doing some really powerful work. And so just to break bread at the United Nations, it is one of the most powerful memories. And to see my dad's loud laugh, and then to see your dad, just sitting next to him, cackling and just looking at it was a beautiful time, and then, of course, at that time, all of us were young, and we were just like, oh, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to be with my friends.
Yeah.
So I think that's how they met, either through Uncle Jan or, through my dad doing the work with, Dudu Dieng and Kofi Annan.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yes, those long days at the UN, man, you're right that it is it's so important and special to see your parents in such a powerful place and just kind of engaged in these deep discussions. But on the other hand, when you're a kid and you're just waiting for it to end, it can seem like it goes on and on.
And so, here's a question and just your observation, because I've had this conversation with a friend of mine who actually lives in New Orleans, and his mother was the ambassador to Tanzania, to, the Dutch. And, he lived in Amsterdam, and he was just talking, and he lived in New York, and he was just telling me his stories of growing up as an ambassador's child, And that is something that stories I don't think is told enough, what it's like growing up as an ambassador's child. I mean, the media always shows kind of like the ambassadors' children as being snobs and getting away with.
Snooty, yeah.
Yeah. But I would love to hear, just your thoughts on growing up around all of these children, because likewise, I grew up around children who weren't like a lot of my classmates. We were exposed to so much. We were such old souls and exposed to art and museums. And, we were doing all kinds of cool things and traveling. It was a very beautiful time, I think. I definitely sure that you benefited from it as well.
Yeah, it was. I completely agree. In so many different ways, there are these little pockets or memories of my upbringing and this kind of international experience and community that feels so special. One tiny example that just popped into my head, which I don't even know the origins of this group, but for a little while on Roosevelt Island, which is where I grew up, in my apartment building, a group of parents got together because since Roosevelt Island is quite close to the United Nations, it has a pretty international population. There are a lot of, I think, people who work at the UN who settle on Roosevelt Island. But so there's this group, it was like an African children's group / like just like African/Black, because I remember us doing a particular thing about Rosa Parks. So it was not necessarily like, it was also grounded in the American experience. And they would bring us together to the community room in the building, and they would have us doing all kinds of, extracurricular learning. And I think that a lot of those kids were first generation like myself and, had parents who were working in the international community. And that was really special. I also, K-8, I went to the United Nations school. So I was exposed to a lot of children who had parents, who were ambassadors or who worked in some kind of way in the foreign service or were involved in, NGOs or any kind of international organization, which was so cool. And I ended up transferring to a different high school because actually, I think, as grotesque as it sounds, one of the things that was very alluring to me about this other school is I really was intrigued by the, quote, American high school experience, which was not getting at my international school. I wanted to go somewhere with a football team and with kind of more of a campus because UNIST, the United Nations School, is it's in Lower Manhattan. It's like on a tiny campus. It's very much a New York City / international school. And I really wanted something that felt more traditional. So I went to this school, lovely school. It had green spaces and just like a lot more of a so-called traditional experience. And then the shift there, from a very international population to one that, was just kind of more of your standard New York City private school was an adjustment because all of a sudden that kind of international mix of my classmates fell away and there was less familiarity with the kind of international world, that you and I were so used to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so after you went to the United Nations school, you went on to college. Can you talk a little bit about just your experience in college? And did that motivate you to write Master, which is a phenomenal film? And, and mommy was like, grasping because she watched it out of love for you, but, she hates horror. She hates horror movies. So she just closed her eyes and she said, "Is it done yet?" Yeah, Ma, you can watch now. But she braved it for her niece.
Hey, that's love.
So tell us about just, you going on off to college, and did that inspire you to write Master, which is a phenomenal film. If my audience hasn't seen it on Amazon, and it's one of the best that Regina Hall has, acted in.
Thank you so much. Regina is incredible. What an amazing person. I just was pinching myself every day that I got to work with her. But yeah, I think that so much of Master was inspired by my college experience. So I did undergrad at Yale, which, I guess any parent honestly is thrilled for their kid to go to college. My dad, as an African parent was losing his mind. The only other one, I remember when we were doing tours and we toured, it's like all name brand recognition for him. We toured Swarthmore, amazing school. He had never heard of it, didn't want to hear about it. We go to Harvard. Suddenly, oh no, I just think this would be a great fit for you. And I'm like, why? I think we know. So, it was very exciting to get in and go. And it was on the whole, funnily enough, judging by the tone of Master, but on the whole, it was a very positive experience. I made my best friends who are still my friends to this day. I had amazing professors. I had classes that really challenged me. But there was also a very dark undercurrent to the atmosphere and to the dynamic. Yale's in New Haven, Connecticut, which at one time was a thriving, mid-sized city. But at this point, its surrounding industries have basically crumbled, and the only job sector is the school. So you have a fairly, impoverished surrounding population who are working at the university with a very privileged student body. There are literal gates at the school. You have to enter, not even into buildings, but just kind of to enter into some spaces, because there are like gated quads and stuff like that. You need to have an ID, otherwise you're locked out. And, sure, there are security reasons for this, I imagine, but it also, it makes an uneasy dynamic. And when you add on to this, all of the racial dynamics at play, it's that much more uncomfortable. So there was so much that I just wanted to unpack and explore in the film. And there were a lot of different social movements that were cropping up, not while I was there as much as a few years later when I started writing this. So it was like, it was such a deeply personal project. And it was so much about kind of looking back at my time there and what I had noticed and what I hadn't noticed. Because there was a lot, I would say, that I was refusing to pay attention to, which was probably wise in a certain sense, because it allowed me to get through it, but wise, but perhaps not healthy. So I had to really, I had to unpack a lot, and I did it in part through the film.
I think it's such a powerful film that every parent, not to scare, students of color, Black women, all of that, but it is conversations on, what happens when we show up in spaces that historically have not invited us in. And especially when considering, Ivy League schools, because there is a certain culture that is embedded in these schools, and it is oftentimes very hard to negate. And I think I told you that story of my mom when she was the dean of English at Northwestern, and this was like the late 70s or 80s, and it made her tear up when she watched Master, because she told me, and I think I told you this, but I'll tell it to our audience, but she was a new, one of the first, not one of the first, but she was one of the African-American professors, to be a dean at Northwestern University. And she used to run this, and, this house, it was called the Black House. And it's basically a safe space for Black students at Northwestern. And this was like the late 70s and 80s. So a lot was going on, the apartheid movement, all kinds of things were going on at that time. And I remember her telling me that there was a Black student from the west side of Chicago when she started who jumped off of a building and killed himself, and he just couldn't, deal with all of the things, the issues that he was dealing with. And she said she remembered going to the funeral, and she had just started. And that gave her the motivation to make sure that she made sure that Black students felt safe and had a place just to be, and so she remembered I remember her telling me she went to the funeral, and the privileged kids, they were laughing, because, and they were joking because because his family, who were from impoverished neighborhoods on the west side of Chicago. And, they had an authentically where he was from funeral, And so that, gave her the motivation to say, no, I'm going to hold space for students, Black students who are coming to Northwestern. And even to her death, you were at the funeral, a lot of them showed up from Northwestern, and she called them her Black House babies. Yes. And one of them was like Harry Lennox Jr., who became this famous actor. And, all of these, students that graduated from Northwestern, and they were just it was a beautiful tribute just to how impactful she was. And I know it has shaped me based on growing up as a child and seeing, what she did at Northwestern,
Yeah, I do remember that story. It just gives me the chills. And the sad thing is that, in touring a little bit around with this film and talking to some audiences, I began to hear a lot of stories like that. And it's just very tragic because I think that, especially before, resources like the Black House that, Auntie Alice headed up, there just is this lack of support, and a lot of people who fall through the net because it goes beyond. It's not necessarily, school might offer academic support, but somebody might not need that. That's not where the issue is. It's entering into a space that feels hostile, that can really wear down on a student's mentality.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, after that experience with Yale, what happened to get you, or were you, I can't remember if you were majoring in film at Yale, or what was the next phase of your life?
Yeah, so I was at the time, I'm not sure if it's changed. I think maybe it has. But at the time, as far as film, the major that was offered was film studies, which was primarily theoretical, which is good. I think I'm glad. If there had been a production option, I might have gone for that and missed a lot more of this theoretical underpinning. But it meant that there was a lot of practical stuff that I had to figure out after graduating. And I ended up, I guess, in a move that's not entirely surprising, given, again, our parents and their very outward-looking mindset. I ended up proposing a documentary project in Mexico that I was able to get a travel fellowship for. And so shortly after graduating, maybe about a year after graduating, I began work on this project in Veracruz, the state of Veracruz, Mexico. And I spent most of my time in the capital of Jalapa. And this was like, it was a quest, and it was an endless, never-ending quest to make this project that I just wanted to be so many different things. But the benefit was also that I was living on my own in Mexico. I made some amazing contacts in particular with one family that lived in this small town about an hour outside of Jalapa. So part of the basis of the project was investigating Afro-Mexican communities as inspired by this trip that my parents had taken to Mexico in, I believe, the 70s, before they were even married. And they kept on hearing about this almost mythical land of Veracruz where all of the Black people were, but they never went. And they were always so curious about what was there. So for the project, I finally went to see if indeed there were Black people in Veracruz, and there are. They're Afro descendants, so it's still a mixed community, but they are aware and proud of their history. So I started going over there, and there's a family there who kind of took me under their wing, and I just kind of lived amongst them and did a lot of filming. And so I was there on this project for about a little bit under 2 years. And at the same time, just kind of living and eventually working, at this restaurant in Mexico. So it was a really, really great formative experience. And I'm so glad that I had the chance to do it.
We'll be back, y'all, after a few messages from our advertisers to continue this fascinating conversation with Mariama Diallo about film, food, family, and now we're talking about Mexico. So we're going to continue with this story about Mexico because I also want to piggyback off of something that she said. So we'll be back after a few messages from our advertiser. Thank you for joining Culture and Flavor.
Hearst Ranch is a proud sponsor of the Heritage Radio Network. The Hearst family has been raising cattle on the rich, sustainable native grasslands of California's Central Coast for over 150 years. Piedra Blanca Rancho in San Simeon is the original Hearst Ranch, founded by George Hearst in 1865. George's son was the famous publisher William Randolph Hearst. In addition to being known for building the iconic Hearst Castle, William was, like his father before him, an avid rancher. In his words, "I would rather spend a month at the ranch than any place in the world." Thanks to one of the largest land conservation easements in California history, a joint effort with the California Rangeland Trust, the American Land Conservancy, and the state of California, the working landscape at Hearst Ranch will be preserved forever. Learn more about Hearst Ranch at HearstRanch.com.
All right, we're back. It's so funny that I remember you coming back from that. And I remember like being at your house, and my dad was, notoriously in the front room with all his new newspapers, in the living room. And he's like, Mariama just came back from Mexico.
I can hear him.
Can't you hear him? And then my mom's just sitting there. I'm so proud of her. And I just, talking about Mexico, funny story, because we have so many like family stories, extended family stories of all of our characters in our little family circle. But, I remember my dad, he was in Mexico and he met, I think, the ex-president of Mexico, Echeverria. And we were living in Mexico when I was younger, and Jan Carew was living there as well. And I just remember he got the key to the state of Jalisco. And I found that in his papers when he died. I'm like, how does this man, it's so Buzz Palmer. It's crazy.
Just casually,
but we were in Veracruz. And Veracruz, I remember being in Veracruz now that you mention it. And I was just like, wow, it was. Yes. And I remember the kids like swimming for, and people, would throw them coins off the boats and, just so weird. And it comes back to New Orleans as well, because after the Louisiana Purchase, a lot of Black folks fled to Veracruz. So in their dishes, they also have definitely Louisiana Creole, attributes. They still use filet, they use okra, a lot of different things. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I hadn't ever realized that connection.
Yeah. They were like, I'm out of here, after the Louisiana Purchase. They're like, I don't want to be a part of this because y'all a little bit way too brutal for me.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. That kind of cross-cultural exchange. I remember I remember in Mississippi, I road tripped through there a couple of years ago. We're seeing all these tamales everywhere. Mm-hmm. And eventually we were wondering, like, how did tamales get over here? And we were trying to look into the history of, was there like some sort of like, westward movement or like, from Mexico, like how did this happen? And I could never quite get an answer, but I think it said that it was like a migratory pattern, and there was a kind of, there was a Mexican population that just like introduced the tamale, or maybe it was like, but anyway, it's fascinating.
Absolutely. Mexicans they've always been here, right? So,
right. It used to be in part their country.
Yeah. Right. So, the tamales is, but of course they became a little bit smaller and hot tamales, and they had their own, a creolized version of it. And they see, I see people sometimes in New Orleans, they call it the popular brand is Manuel's hot tamales, and people sell them, out of their back of their car. So I'm thinking about my dad. He loved tamales. I don't know if you remember that, but he loved tamales, and he always had, oh my God, like wherever we go, do you have some tamales? He just loved tamales. And I don't know, because I don't know, but maybe it's because his mom was from Mississippi too. I'm not sure, but I just wonder we grew up obviously in Chicago, and Chicago has a huge, Mexican population, and part of our diet and our cultural memory is definitely Mexican and Puerto Rican at the same time, because we married, and into each other, we lived in the same neighborhoods. I mean, the same thing as New York, right?
Yeah.
New York is you can't tell me that people don't know what mofongo is, or, all the great stuff, because it's affordable food. You can get a plate of food, from a Dominican or Puerto Rican restaurant and not have to eat, a processed food.
Yeah. And it's your neighbors.
And then even with Uncle Wambu, right? When you talk about the tamales, I'm thinking about Uncle Wambu. And when we look 20 years from now, I mean, at every Thanksgiving, he hires a caterer, and, he brags about that caterer. I can't remember her name, but she makes jollof rice. She makes jambalaya. She makes all of these, she makes macaroni, cheese, green. She makes Kenyan cuisine. She makes West African cuisine, all kinds of different dishes. And it's so funny because, like, when I took a student to Nairobi last year for a conference, and I stayed at Aunt Penny's house, Uncle Wambu's wife's house. And Kenyan, food culture, they don't put a lot of seasoning in their food. And then she just kept on remarking about, how Uncle Wambu has all this seasoning in the cabinet. She just thought it was just so strange. And it's because he has literally been around, West Africans and Black Americans and living in New York for a long time.
Yes.
He's going to bring some Louisiana hot sauce and some cream cheese.
Okay.
And he made gumbo for his birthday. I thought they were like, oh, he made gumbo for his birthday.
He made gumbo, yes.
He was so proud of it.
I'm gonna mix it up over here.
Listen.
One summer that just reminded me of this memory of one summer we were going to Senegal, where, when I was growing up, we would go almost on a yearly basis, maybe every year and a half. And we brought Parmesan cheese, for pasta, if we ever made pasta. And the way that everybody on the Senegalese side sniffed that Parmesan cheese and stayed a mile away from it, they were looking at us like we were insane. It's so funny.
I want to go to Senegal with you. I've never been, and I would love to go. Yeah. I told Uncle Jabril like many times. He's like, come. He's like, what are you waiting for? I'm like, yeah. So, but yeah, I want to get back to just the film part, because it just fascinates me, your journey, and just where you are. How do you tell these Black stories? Because at a recent podcast interview, I interviewed Alelia Bundles, who wrote Madam C.J. Walker's, her great-great-grandmother's biography. And she was part of the initial phase of putting out Self-Made on Netflix, a Netflix series, but it turned into something completely different from the original story. And it bothered her immensely that, the original story that she put out, the authentic story, turned into, in her words, a Real Housewives of Atlanta episode,
Oh, no.
So how do you stay grounded in telling Black stories, even with all the like pressures of, that's not really how it's supposed to be. And, and because, I'm just going to say this last part. A chef friend of mine, Gladys Niath, she's a Cameroonian, and she posted this just to show us, what people go through. And she was cooking for this film crew, and the stylist got the consistency of her fufu wrong. And she's like, this isn't how it's supposed to be. And they're like, oh, just work with it. And, and she said, no, my grandparents, my parents, my whole country will be done with me if I put this on camera. Are you serious?
Right. She said, don't get me canceled by my family.
So how do you tell stories, and how do you stay grounded in telling Black stories that aren't fetishized?
I think it's a great question. And it's probably going to be an ongoing learning process for me. One of the things that I discovered, which is particularly insidious, is, there are the more obvious bad actors, and not literally actors, but, like bad actors who might approach. They might send a script, that's just obviously stereotypical, even if they don't realize it, or that is playing into certain tropes that, many of us are trying to move past. And that's easier to sidestep and to avoid. I think that there are also, though, a lot of ostensibly well-intentioned people who nevertheless are still exerting forces that result in a product that is miles away from the original intent. And so it sounds like, that potentially happened, to your other podcast interview. I think that it's really important to have a strong creative team, kind of like a production team around you who understand what you're doing and are able to fight for you. Because I think that as the writer, director, there's a certain level of pushback that you won't even be brought into. There are some negotiations that the writer or the director won't be privy to, and it's really happening more on a producerial level. And so if your producers don't really get what you're going for, they can't protect you in the way that you need to be protected. So I'm very lucky that I have some producers who I regularly work with who don't play that, and who understand what the vision is. And there's always going to be, some kind of give and take and compromise when you're trying to make a film. Also, just because there's so many people involved, and you're having one initial piece of work interpreted by ultimately, 100+ people, it's going to move away in some kind of way. And hopefully it's in a positive direction because everybody adds something of their vision and it moves it forward to something that you couldn't have even come up with before. But it's gonna move in some kind of way. So you want to be so deliberate about your team, and you have to keep on checking in at every level. But sometimes I think also some people just get stuck in a situation where, like, you signed on the dotted line and you thought that you were getting one thing, and all of a sudden you're getting another, and then it's like, you just have to duke it out until the very end.
I think also, thank you for sharing that. But I think also, when I think at my level in academia, you went to Yale and you talked a little bit about film studies and how it's more theoretical. When I think about our parents, and I'm sure, how your mommy, Aunt Alice loved film so much. I'm sure she was recommending so many films for you to watch because she adored films, And I think about when I sometimes look at the curriculum for film students, it always is with Alfred Hitchcock, and there's nothing wrong with that, but very, 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 very minimal exposure to some of the incredible African-American, Caribbean films, Latin American. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And I remember just like, because my mother loved film so much, she loved Hollywood films. She loved, we were watching A Thin Man, that was one of her favorite movies from the 1930s. And she loved like 1930s fashion. And we were watching all of these incredible like productions. And, every year we'd watch White Christmas. And she grew up during that era. She was born in the late 30s, And so, but I also remember being a kid and her exposing me to Black Orpheus from Brazil. And like, we would go to like the double feature film show before, things really got digitized. And we would watch Black Orpheus and The Harder They Come with Jimmy Cliff. And they would get all riled up and, because they were part of that moment where, they were decolonizing. They were the original decolonizers,
Yeah.
So then they'd have all these discussions, and and then I even remember them talking to your dad just about in Senegal and that whole negritude movement, and just I would love for you kind of just to talk about how did you educate your own self on films, historical films and did it help with your writing or just grounding yourself so that you could write epic screenplays to be produced on the big screen? I think that's important. I mean, because even some of these film students, they don't have a lot of historical background, and I think that's really problematic.
Oh, absolutely. And it's exactly like you said, your standard film class, when they're running through the classics, it'll be, 99% white male directors with maybe a Spike Lee film and, one white woman thrown in for good measure. And that's it. And even Spike himself was taken to task when he released online his syllabus. I think it was a list of about 50 films that film students should watch. And it shortly became clear that there were no women, certainly any Black women filmmakers on that list, which he quickly corrected and he updated it. But it's such an oversight because there are actually, it might be a small number, but it was a hugely influential number of Black women directors. But there's kind of this gap in the public awareness. So even for myself, it took until doing some of that digging myself that I found, for instance, the work of Julie Dash and, saw Daughters of the Dust in college, kind of similar, to your mother. My mom was a huge lover of film and film of all types. It's not necessarily like she was a cinephile. She just loved a good movie. And so that led me to see the incredible Eve's Bayou when it came out. And I just remember that being such a huge moment for me. And, that was directed by a Black woman. And that's I think that's, it's major film of the 1990s, but it doesn't always, now it's getting more of its due, but I think that it was overlooked in a way that was not fair. I did get very lucky my freshman year of college. There was a professor named Terry Francis who was the head of the film department, the director of undergraduate studies, I think was her title at the time. And she was a Black woman, very, very committed to exposing us to, Black filmmakers. That is where I watched The Harder They Come, was in her class. She made sure to have that on the syllabus. And she really did expose us to just some really great works. And I later, she taught the introductory film class for freshmen. And then I think it was my senior year, I also took a seminar with her. And that was just so lucky to be able to dive even deeper, see Ganja and Hess, just see, some of these really groundbreaking works of art by Black filmmakers. And it was also really exciting. You mentioned in Senegal and the Negritude movement, for me to go in and discover Senegalese filmmakers, Jibril Diop Mambedi. And I just saw some films that really, really changed my perspective. And it's just so exciting because you're seeing artists create work. They're doing things that you might not even necessarily be allowed to do, in Western cinema. And they're really stretching the medium. They're being creative. They're using all the resources available to them. They're having the community come together sometimes to make, this piece of work in collaboration. That was so crucial to me in unlocking a way that I approach storytelling and really try to challenge myself to move out of a more Western, 1, 2, 3 paradigm.
Let me ask you too, how do you, as a director, when you have your director hat on, do you pay attention to the food that is also being filmed in the films? Because, when I think about just so many films that I've watched over the years, especially with my mom when she was alive, because she was big on that, how How is food integral to telling a story and thinking of even just films that have Black folks in them? How has food been integral to telling Black stories?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. One of the first things that it calls to mind for me is this tendency in Nollywood films, at least in classic Nollywood films. I think probably the editing has sped up, today, but it's something that I've always observed and kind of very lovingly laughed about with like my mom and my family is how much time in Nollywood films can be given over to a character. They will show the character sit there, start to cook the food, cut the food,
So
kind of
true.
like prep the food, cook it. It's like, I feel like in a lot of American media, that's really kind of more about getting through a moment quickly. There's like maybe like a couple of shots just to establish what's happening. Whereas, in a lot of Nollywood films, it's like they'll take you on the journey of making that food and then eating it. And it's really luxuriating in a certain kind of relaxed cultural experience that those are some of the most memorable instances of food on film for me. And I love it. And it's interesting to think about in a way that I hadn't, necessarily considered before, but that probably does also carry over into, some like Black media in the States as well is a little bit more care and like community founded around food. There's an obvious example of soul food where it's in the very name of the film, but there's kind of a moment. It's almost like not a trope, but it's like it's almost built into a certain kind of like dramatic comedy Black film where like there will be a time when the characters are all sitting around the table together and really like like laughing, fighting, and like just really communing in a way that I think is really cool and probably not accidental.
So true. As we tell more Black stories and we bring these stories to light, I want to thank you, Mariama, so much for being such an incredible filmmaker. I know that my parents would be so proud of you and they will be with you every step of the way. I feel there's, I feel their presence all the time. And I feel that they check up on us all the time just to see what we're doing. So I'm so grateful that you allowed me to interview you and that we can have this moment with each other. And I'm hoping that, we see each other again at Uncle Wambu's house for Thanksgiving.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And what do we have to look forward to? Are you working on any projects that you can tell us about now, or, just your thoughts on this time period? Because, Daddy used to always say that we're in an axial age right now. It's so much political upheaval. It's so much happening right now. And there's lots of shifts in power, stories being told. How do you see your work shining through this period?
Well, I 100% believe that Uncle Buzz and Auntie Alice are listening in right now on us. Yeah. I'm like chiming in comments, like, shooting the breeze with each other. I do feel them all the time. And, it's funny, not to digress, but I don't think I ever got a chance to tell you, but this was the day after Auntie Alice's memorial. I went jogging and there's like in Chicago, there's like, I don't know, I'm going to get the name of it mixed up. It's maybe called like, I don't know, like the 508 or the 6 or something. It's like, it's like the High Line in New York. It's a running / green path that's above ground.
Lakeshore Drive. Yeah.
Yeah. And I went running along it. And at the very end, at the end of the trail, you can see this building with a mural on the side of it. And it said La Luta Continua.
Oh my God. Don't make me cry.
It was like, oh my gosh, I got the chills and I thought this was no accident. God. It was amazing. Jesus. It was the next day. So that was so special. And I feel like, I'm just going to continue to hopefully get signs like that and feel their presence all the time. But for me, for next things up, I'm working on a couple of different projects I'm excited about. I'm working on a TV project, and I also am working on a couple of different film projects. I don't know which one is going to be the one to go next. So I don't want to say what the next one is, but I will say that on the film side, one of them is a horror, yes, and then another is more of like a dark social satire that is also really fun. And then on the television side, which is just a fun new area for me to explore, I'm working on a pilot that will, fingers crossed, make it onto the screens at some point in the next couple years.
I can't wait to watch it. And we definitely invite you back to Culture and Flavor when it's out. If you want to talk about it, I would love that because, we have to continue these conversations. And for my listeners who don't know, Aluta Continua was a saying that my parents always said. It means the struggle continues. And we are children of that generation, and we are so grateful for the lessons that we learned at Mariama's house, my house, Uncle Wambu's house, and this just beautiful circle of incredible people who, although in spite of everything that was going on around them, they found community, love, and raised us beautifully. And so I'm so proud of you. All of us are proud of you. And, please give Auntie Florence a big hug from me and say hello to Uncle Jabril, please. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll see each other at some point. Yes. Thank you so much for joining Culture and Flavor, y'all. Culture and Flavor is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org.